Welcome to Purposeful Lab, a Franciscan University production. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Keebler, and this season on the Purposeful Lab, we are exploring transhumanism. I mean, we're looking at how humans are using technology to try to overcome their sort of inherent physical, biological limitations. And so we're looking at it from a bunch of different aspects. And today, my guest is Father Michael Baggot, who he is an associate professor of bioethics, and he's spoken widely on transhumanism. And he is at the Reginum Apostolorum in Rome. He also is on the faculty at the Angelicum and also at the newly formed Catholic Catholic Institute of Technology, which is just outside of Rome. And so, Father Baggot, welcome to the program.
It's great to be here, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that's great to have you. Before we get into talking about transhumanism, just let our listeners get to know a little bit about you. So we were talking before we started filming how you grew up in, for the most part, in Winchester, Virginia. So maybe you just tell us where your vocation story, what got you to recognize you're being called to the priesthood. So that would, we start there.
Well, first I had to discover God. I grew up as an agnostic. I made a long journey. I began to find the beauty and splendor of the church's art and architecture quite intriguing, but I was convinced that traditional religions were basically fairy tales, and so I preferred a more rational, science-based way of life. But I had a hunch that there was some sort of power or designer or creator behind the tremendous beauty that I found in the natural world and also in these artistic creations that intrigued me so much. So I had this hunch that there was something more to life, and I was very reluctant to ascribe all of that beauty and order and apparent purpose that I saw to the random byproduct of blind natural forces. Then I began to read a little bit about philosophy. I came across a book in the library called The Intellectuals Speak Out About God. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Intellectuals don't usually talk about God. So that piqued my interest. And sure enough, I found so many great arguments from scientists and mathematicians and philosophers. And no single argument persuaded me, but there was this tremendous convergence of different types of argument. So some of them were appealing to God as the source of the beginning of the universe. So you have the Kalam cosmological argument. Some of them were less concerned about a temporal beginning of the universe. They were focused on why is there something rather than nothing in this present moment. So you have that sort of metaphysical contingency argument for God that I started to find very intriguing and persuasive. And then others that looked at the moral law that we discover within ourselves, a law that we find that we did not give, that's not simply invented by any individual or any society, that is something discovered, not invented, and that seems to imply some sort of higher, even transcendent lawgiver. So I found all of these different arguments pointing in the same direction, to a God, to a creator. But then it took some more time to begin discovering Christianity in particular. I saw it in the literature that I read. I had a great friend in high school who told me about his youth group and his ministry, even mission work in Africa. And I thought, how is this possible? He's my age, we're in high school, and he's head over heels in love with this Christian faith and willing to make great sacrifices for it. He was also the smartest person that I knew in spite of his Christianity. But I thought, hey, no one's perfect.
How do you fit that together there? Right?
No one's perfect. So as a good friend, I need to study this Christianity business a lot more deeply so that I can rescue him. I can liberate him from the error of his ways, from everything he's been force-fed as a child. And so that sent me on a new stage of the journey. And as I went to the library and was completely overwhelmed with the books that I saw about religion in general, I saw out of the corner of my eye Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And I had no idea what the book was about, but I knew Lewis was a great author because I read Narnia growing up. So I thought, well, this small little book couldn't hurt. And that ended up changing my life as it's changed the life of so many other people. So I started to see the radical claims of Christ, and Lewis's famous Lord, lunatic, liar argument really put me in that position of decision. I said, well, if he's a wise moral teacher and not a crazy man, and if he and his followers left everything and had no apparent earthly motivation of power, pleasure, or comfort to persist in this Christian story, then maybe, just maybe, he's actually who he says he is. He's my Lord and my God. And then that sent me on the new stage of the journey of exploring the different options available, the different churches, and little by little, as I did my deep dive into history and studied scripture more, I found, to my utter surprise and shock, that the Catholic Church alone could claim this 2,000-year historic continuity, and alone could claim to be fully rooted in sacred scripture. Certainly our brothers and sisters in Christ and so many other Christian bodies enjoy many elements of truth and goodness, but it was only there in the Catholic Church that I could find that full patrimony, that fullness of faith and morals that had been trusted to the apostles and preserved, even with all the dark periods of church history and all of the sins of her members. Somehow, some way, God kept his promise and guided his church into all truth. And that brought me into the Catholic Church many years ago as a senior in high school. And then I needed some time just to learn what it meant to be a Christian, how to pray, how to grow in virtue, how to serve others. And that process of friendship and community was what I needed to begin to hear the little whisper, the hint that the Lord might be calling me to serve the way I saw so many great priests serve, and to bring the body and blood of Christ to others, to forgive sins and confession. That part was tremendously appealing, even in my first year in the church. But the idea of celibacy was a really hard sell. So the Holy Spirit had to soften my heart in that. And it took some time for me to see that this was the way he was inviting me to love, that it wasn't a denial of love, but a different way of loving, a way of loving, you could say, more directly, and focused exclusively on him, and a way that, thanks be to God, has allowed me to fulfill that deep desire of being a father, not in the way I expected, not in the beautiful, holy way of being a biological father, which is, of course, a path of holiness, but in an unexpected way of being a spiritual father. And now through teaching and pilgrimages and other forms of accompaniment, I'm happy to say I have lots of children all over the world and really enjoying my spiritual priestly fatherhood.
Yeah, that's a wonderful story. A lot of it unfolded in high school too. It's interesting. You said your conversion and coming into the church then, and a lot of you see these C.S. Lewis having an effect on people, and just people, the question of the beauty and order and purpose that seems to be there, and how to make sense of that. So
yeah, I mean, thinking about the title of this podcast, of this series, right, the Purposeful Lab. That was key the whole time. I mean, that's the unifying thread. Why was I interested in finding God? Well, because I sensed that there was a lack of meaning and purpose in my life. And as I began to explore that transcendent reality, that God began to shed light and show me that there really was a meaning and purpose to my life, something a lot more noble and exciting than just making lots of money and getting a decent job and retiring on the beach. I mean, he opened up to me a whole new horizon of meaning and purpose. And I think that's been the constant drive and motivation, I think, through those other steps, to discover Christ, to discover the church, to pursue the priesthood, to work as a professor, to research all these crazy topics that we'll talk about today that all the other professors in my community tease me about, right?
Yeah. Well, that's great. You brought up the crazy topics that you get research, and so what got you interested in transhumanism? And I know that you're doctoral thesis was focused on that, and then you continued to sort of investigate that after in your professorship. So what is it that possessed you to say, you know what, that's the topic that I'm going to focus on there?
When I was in high school, as still an agnostic, I remember having these great conversations, I would say debates, with my friends in high school about all sorts of issues. And inevitably, we'd get to these hot button issues and lots of bioethical issues. And it was actually in starting to confront those bioethical issues that the reality of an objective moral law really came through to me. And I remember in particular an atheist friend of mine who actually mocked Christianity even more than I did when I was growing up, making these great arguments, basically defending the church's teaching on certain bioethical areas. Like, he was very much in favor of protecting unborn human life. He was opposed to abortion, and he made these really compelling scientific and philosophical arguments. And so as I continued my journey, I had all the more reason coming into the church to go deep in these bioethical issues, because I realized that they were shaping people's lives and their understanding of life and death, quite literally. And I thought, wow, these are such important topics. I need to understand them better, not just for myself, but for any of the people I guide. So I got involved. I was invited to participate in a UNESCO chair of bioethics and human rights that's tied to our university, Regina Apostolorum in Rome, but it has activities around the world. And I was getting involved in some events that we had in New York and tied to the UN, and getting more and more interested in these life and death bioethical issues that were shaping world conversations. And as I continued my studies, of course, the superiors were well aware of my work and asked me if I would continue to go on, and I very gladly accepted. And I've been very passionate about education and hope to devote time and energy to that in my ministry. So I was very happy to be given the opportunity to work on a doctorate immediately after my ordination, which was here in Rome, thanks be to God. And so I started to explore different possible topics, and I had a sense that I wanted to enter into a field that had not been treated exhaustively. I didn't want to do a kind of elaborate book report where I'm just summarizing what everyone else has already said about these issues. I wanted to see what's on the horizon, what's influencing society, and what will continue to shape and influence society. And more and more resources pointed me in the way of transhumanism, because it's so tied to how we use emerging technologies, how we implement AI, how we implement gene editing, how we approach pharmaceutical interventions that may affect our cognitive state. I just saw that it was this place where so many different developments were converging. And I also started to appreciate the fact that even though there were only a small group of people who were official card-carrying transhumanists, part of official associations, that the philosophy, the view of the human person undergirding those proposals, those projects, was actually more widespread than I could have imagined. I often tell people that many members of contemporary societies, especially secularized societies, are far more transhumanist than they think. And there's lots of reasons for that, but I looked particularly at how postmodernism, secularism, a political liberal focus on radical autonomy, and a separation of the body from the mysterious inner self, a kind of radical dualism, how all those different issues converged in transhumanism. And so a lot of people already accept those philosophical presuppositions. It's just in the air we breathe, right? In the music we listen to, in the stories we read, in the television series we watch, in the policies we make. I was surprised by just how transhumanist our societies had become. And I had a chance to speak briefly during a summer course that I was teaching at called the Catholic Worldview Fellowship in Germany. I was privileged to teach with Ryan T. Anderson, who's now is at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, now heading it. And at the time, years ago, he had just finished writing his book on transgenderism. And I asked Ryan in a break, so Ryan, what do you think about transhumanism? You have a really good sense of what's going on in contemporary society and in bioethics. Is this just a fringe movement? Is this just a fad? And he thought about it for a little while and basically told me that he thought it was in many ways going to make a deeper and longer lasting impact on the world, on societies, than transgenderism. And that really struck me, but then the break ended and I didn't really have time to unpack it. But then later in my research, I found several authors who connected the movements and who support both movements. So this is not just some idea of a priest trying to make weird connections. It's actually advocates of transhumanism and transgenderism as a kind of philosophy, as an anthropology, a view of the person. There are several thinkers who connect them. And in many ways, they're connecting them, the movements, precisely in this idea of being able to radically define yourself, create yourself, to manipulate the body to conform to the ideal of the self, which is not really a spiritual soul, because many of these thinkers are uncomfortable with the notion of a spiritual soul, but they want to talk about this notion of the self that is distinct from and even separable from the body, which becomes still important, but a kind of external instrument that's subordinated to the will and the self-determination of that mysterious inner self. So I said, wait a second, if there are those sorts of connections, then transhumanism is a lot more widespread and present and of serious interest and concern than maybe I anticipated when I just started to read about it as a kind of sci-fi possibility.
Right. Yeah. I think a lot of people just, it's a sci-fi possibility. It's not something that's really undergoing. But that you're right that philosophy there, that sort of technologically we can fix ourselves in the way that we want. This inherent dualistic version. My body is just limiting me. That's the sort of the transgender movement. But the same thing with the transhumanism. My body is limiting me, and we're going to talk this season about how do we genetically modify it to do what I want it to do. How do I neurologically enhance it to do what I want it to do? Because my inner self, as you point out, they're not talking about their souls, but their inner self is different from the body, right? This is like my body, I can manipulate it so it's more in line with who I want to be and what I envision. And there's this reliance on sort of technology is going to fix the problems of humanity, right? But they don't realize we're already starting to do that, even though we're not necessarily transhumanists or getting to something different than human. So how would you define transhumanism? And do you think, just to set the stage, do you think that project is even possible? Is it possible to turn us into something that isn't human, that go beyond that, right? Is that even possible?
Yeah, those are great questions, and there's a lot there. So in terms of what transhumanism is, I love it because I often give talks and I find myself about 30 minutes in, I was like, oh, by the way, transhumanism is the following. This is what you've come to hear about. But transhumanism is often presented as an intellectual and cultural movement to radically enhance the human species at different levels, at a cognitive level to make us smarter, at a mood level to make our emotional life more pleasant and enjoyable, at a physical level to make us stronger, fitter, and so forth. And then even at a moral level, proposals to assist us to more reliably and consistently make good decisions and be motivated to make the right decisions to guide society and collaborate to form a better world. And then, of course, there's a lot of talk within this movement as well about radical life extension, if not a kind of immortality, which is often understood as a digital immortality, as one in which we achieve that fuller liberation from the body. So a lot of those earlier projects, this cultural intellectual movement that's focused on radical enhancement, is usually in its initial stages trying to make this bodily, finite, temporal life better, smarter, fitter, happier, right? And that sounds very appealing and attractive. But then many want to transition from that kind of human state, that radically enhanced state, to a post-human state, which is where you get that notion of a fuller liberation from the body. And of course, within the transhumanist thinkers, there are debates about exactly which projects are feasible or even desirable. So I am very interested in the dialogue that we can have about using great technological developments to make our life better in different ways. If we can safely, effectively improve our physical well-being, even achieve a richer cognitive life, perhaps in memory, in facial recognition, in problem solving, if we can achieve a generally more balanced or even positive emotional experience, then those could all be positive goods that technology contributes to our life that then we have to decide to use well instead of abusing. So they don't guarantee that we become better people in a moral sense, but they might be used well to serve others, to put our talents, our capacities at the service of others in whatever particular vocation or service we're called to. So I think there's a lot of room in dialogue about some of those potential enhancements there. We have to assess them seriously and above all make sure that they're done in a way that's safe and effective, and also make sure that there are not serious negative side effects in other areas of our life that we're missing out on. So we have to be very cautious, I think, before we embrace any enhancement. But there's room for dialogue there. What I think is most troubling about the movement is the undergirding philosophy that brings that radical dualism and gives the illusion that the body is a kind of instrument that is accidental, optional to our well-being and flourishing. And I think these projects of digital immortality, and there are different versions of this, for instance, the idea that we might be able to do a full brain emulation or map out the patterns of our neurons and sort of gather the data about our personality, our memories, our beliefs, our desires, our interests, and create that neurological map that is, in a sense, extractable, that we can download and then transfer or upload to a cloud. Those sorts of projects, I contend, are impossible not because of a technical limitation. It's not that we just need to wait until the technology gets better and gathers more information. I think there's a philosophical problem that prevents that from being a reality, which is why I think they're dreams that are doomed to disappoint, because they miss out on our fundamental animality, our fundamental corporality, the fact that our personhood includes this essential bodily, corporal dimension. This is not a sort of added extra that is dispensable once our technology advances properly. So that's, I think, a very important distinction to make, that we're not just dealing with a technological problem that requires some advances. We're dealing with a philosophical misunderstanding of the human person. The separation of the body from the self or from the soul is death, right? That is death. And while we as Catholics believe that God can preserve our separated souls and that it is a spiritual principle not subject to corruption, that state of separation is something that is unnatural to us. There's something incomplete about our personhood, which is also why, as Christians, we have a hope and a longing to be reunited with the body to which that spiritual principle remains always intrinsically tied. We're not just sort of transmigrated and just put into a new car, a new system, a new body. There's still that intrinsic connection to a particular body rather than to another one. So we have that state of incomplete personhood that is completed with the resurrection. So that's a point of fundamental divide between contemporary secular transhumanists' vision of our nature and of our destiny. And you can see how they've begun to propose this kind of alternative eschatology, this alternative view of our destiny, of our mission. And I think that our call as Catholics is to draw on a rich philosophical, not only theological, but just philosophical patrimony to help everyone appreciate more fully how our highest expressions of intellectual life, our decisions, our moral agency is lived in a very corporal, bodily way. Our consciousness, many thinkers talk about our consciousness as being an embedded and inactive reality. So there's this relationship with our environment that shapes and forms even these higher spiritual dimensions. We're neither mere animals, mere beasts, nor are we angels, pure spirits. We're a rather fascinating being where we have these two irreducible co-principles in the human person. So I often tell people that my work in transhumanism puts me in this position where as a priest, I find myself spending sometimes more effort and energy convincing people of the importance of the body than I do of the soul. Just because there can be a distorted understanding of our nature, and we lose sight of just how central that corporality is. And so I think for us, the fulfillment that secular transhumanists are longing for, that they desire, and God bless them for looking to improve our life and looking to come to a higher state. I mean, those are good desires and aspirations to improve ourselves and to use the tools of technology. Those good aspirations, I think, go astray because of this unfortunate, impoverished view of the human person that many simply inherit. It's not that they've necessarily had the chance to think seriously through different anthropologies. It's just many places in contemporary societies just kind of take this impoverished view of the person for granted. And so it's really our responsibility to enrich it and to recall the complexity and richness of the hylomorphic union.
It's almost incoherent because there's this dualistic attitude, but there's also this materialistic attitude. It's like we can put the brain over here, but it's all material. We put our mind over here, our self over here, and remove ourselves from the body, but they don't see this intimate connection between the body and the person. But then the person can be reduced to a physical thing. So it doesn't, it's dualistic and materialistic at the same time, which seems almost
you're right. You're right. There's a serious tension there. There's a serious tension, unfortunately.
There's something that you said I want to follow up on because I find that interesting because a lot of critics of transhumanism, at least from a Christian standpoint, just say, hey, we can't do anything. We're not allowed. Technology is bad. We shouldn't be doing anything to alter the human state. But there is this sense of that you're not a technophobe here. You're not saying that any technology is bad. How would you be able to properly discern whether, assuming that there's no side effects, and we'll assume it's safe and there's no side effects, but determine whether some type of enhancement actually is something that we should pursue? Because it might touch on this sort of distinction people make between enhancements and therapy and how that can be a problematic distinction. But then how would you know something that actually is enhancing our ability? Like you said, enhancing our memory. How would we know whether that's something we should pursue? from a Catholic perspective. Yeah.
Right. That's a good question, because in a lot of the literature, whether it be Catholic or secular bioethical literature on some of these questions about transhumanism or enhancements in general, deal with this therapy and enhancement distinction, which I think is important and worth considering. So generally, we understand therapy as something that repairs the body, restores the body, brings it back to a kind of normal functioning. And most schools of thought, most traditions recognize that this is central to the project of medicine. And most people are very grateful for different forms of technological therapies. So there's generally there's pretty clear common ground in a lot of clearly therapeutic interventions. And then you get to enhancement, which is often understood as something that brings us beyond that state of repair or restoration, that involves making us, as one author says, healthier than healthy, kind of going beyond the statistical norm of biological health and good functioning for whatever category of people you may be looking at, age group, gender, and so forth. So that moving beyond the biological statistical norm of health and good functioning is something that should bring us to pause and consider whether this is something that might have some of these unforeseen, at the moment, side effects, something that may cause a burden to us in another regard, in which case we ought to be reticent, if not outright reject the procedure. But I think that if something is moving us beyond this level and is making us healthier than healthy, going beyond the statistical norm of biological functioning, if it is safe, effective, and is not producing serious negative side effects, it can be potentially incorporated into the pursuit of the good life. But when we're dealing with these different interventions, we're dealing with goods that can be used well or poorly. So assuming we have reliable, safe ways of improving our memory through pharmaceutical interventions or different forms, perhaps even of brain-computer interface, but of course there's a whole host of other concerns to address there. If we do reliably improve our memory, for instance, then that could be a great aid to our study of the truth, our study of scripture, of history. And as a professor, that's not just personally enriching, that is a good that I can put at the service of my students and of other people I guide. So I can use that particular enhancement for good and for the service of others in a virtuous way, but I can also use that to get more information about people so I can tap into their vulnerabilities and I can flatter them and I can manipulate them, and that would be a more vicious use of it. So I think in a lot of these interventions, we have to go back to the question of what is the good life? Who is the person and what is the person made for? And thankfully, we have so many great resources, ancient and contemporary updated views of virtue ethics that give us a very complete and comprehensive view of how all of our faculties can be perfected through the development of different virtues. So if the particular intervention is being placed at the service of that development in virtue or is being used by the virtuous person in a good way, I think it can be prudentially integrated into that good life, but it should never be an impediment or a distraction from other goods, especially non-physical goods. So I can be the strongest, fittest, most brilliant sinner in the world. None of those qualities or characteristics that improve my physical, cognitive, or emotional life necessarily guarantee a moral improvement. But they could be elements that I use well in a virtuous way that enrich my life and enrich the life of others. So I think one of the fascinating things about looking at these debates on the wise prudential use of enhancement technology is that they cause us to step back a moment from the very particular technical and ethical considerations to step back to deeper questions about human nature and human purpose, so that we can better step back in to the nitty-gritty technological and ethical assessment that we really have to do with each case. And so that's not relativism, that's prudence, right? It's taking into account all of the different particularities of the intervention and of the person's responsibilities, the person's vocation, to see how to integrate that well and use it as a good mean. If someone prefers maybe a more explicitly spiritual take on this very philosophical approach, I think very often about St. Ignatius. He talks at the beginning about our purpose in life to know, love, and serve God, and to bring others to that same experience. And everything on the face of the earth should be used insofar, tantum quantum, insofar as it contributes to that purpose and mission. And so if an intervention helps me to live better my fundamental meaning and purpose in this life and helps others to do the same, by all means, use it. But if it's a distraction or a deterrence from that, then it needs to be set aside.
It seems that a lot of these, I see what you're saying there about these, but it seems a lot of these, like in cognitive enhancement and memory enhancement, they certainly could be used to help serve the good and to live the virtuous life and to fulfill and to serve God. But they also could be used in ways that would do the opposite, right? For some, because again, it's someone has to make the decision of how they're going to use the enhancement, right? So it seems, does that give you any pause for caution? Because it seems like I can't think of, maybe you could think of an enhancement that would only be used for the good. But once we enhance somebody, yeah, it could be used for good, and it could be used to, if they're trying to strive for virtue, to help them increase in virtue. And like you said, as a professor, be able to teach more and be able to give more truth to your students. But you could also use it, like you said, for nefarious purposes. And so
right.
Does that give you pause to think, well, maybe we shouldn't do any of these, enhancements, just because they can lead to even greater evil, in a sense? And I've heard people make that argument.
Sure. Yeah, at the very least, we need a lot of healthy caution. And part of that caution is that there are sometimes these trade-offs. So I think, for instance, in the realm of different cognitive enhancements, and these have been around for a while, lots of dual use for particular pharmaceutical interventions that are used to help people for a kind of recognized medical condition that can also be used by people without that condition. So we have lots of examples of medication offered for people who struggle with attention that could be used by people without that particular struggle to gain a cognitive edge and focus better and cram better for their exam, or exactly. to get to the bar and complete the bar. Or so you can think of these different approaches, and we've often found that there are these real trade-offs. So maybe something that helps you to do better in short-term memory actually has long-term detrimental neurological effects, including on your long-term memory. Even in the realm of creativity, of course, you want a cognitive edge, and you think, okay, if I can focus and work and advance and take my Adderall that's usually prescribed, say, for people who struggle with narcolepsy, to give me a greater attentiveness, we think of that, that's a clear kind of cognitive boost that will give me an edge. But we find that sometimes these boosts that help us in concentration and focus will basically give us the edge in very repetitive, fixed tasks, but sometimes impede the kind of context shifting and cognitive connections that we value in creative endeavors. So sometimes what is an enhancement in one dimension, even one dimension within, say, our cognitive realm, is actually something that has a negative impact in another part of our cognitive life. So sometimes there are enhancements that are kind of enhancements with an asterisk. And so when we have that sort of real trade-off, that's all the more reason for us to be patient, to wait, let's assess this, let's see the full effects. Aside from all of the really bad negative uses that people can use these different advantages for, there are lots of legitimate social concerns where people rightly point out the risk of exacerbating already unjust social systems or disparities. So you can think of how a rich elite group would have easier access to physical, cognitive, mood enhancements that would exacerbate a gap between those who are less privileged, less fortunate, less able to receive this sort of attention. And then all sorts of social justice questions and healthcare allocation questions,
Right.
where people say, well, why are we giving a minority of people improved memory when they're healthy, when others struggle to get basic care or drinking water? So there are lots of serious practical, prudential justice questions in addition to just the basic assessment of any kind of serious trade-offs or negative side effects or potential for misuse that could come about. So as you can tell, we're just scratching the surface.
Layer
There's
upon
tremendous
layer upon layer.
tremendous complexity there. But I really think that the church can and should be a leader in this, to continue a serious dialogue and see what are the positive aspirations and goals of this movement to improve people's lives at different levels through developing technologies. We ought to do this, and we ought to be leaders in that. And then when we identify flaws or faults, or we identify impoverished philosophy, we can also be there to enrich the conversation, to reorient the conversation. But I don't think it's a simple matter of like wagging our fingers or just demonizing people about these wicked things they're doing. We say, okay, what's positive here? What needs to be purified? And then how can we really harness these technologies to put them at the service of the human person and direct our goals to the right direction? You know, it's fascinating to think of the fact that long before transhumanism was used as a secular term, it was used even in the Catholic tradition. Dante brings up this term in the Divine Comedy, in this famous poem, in the Paradiso, the last section where he's entering into heaven, in this poetic vision of heaven, and he sees the saints, and he uses the term transhumanar, this idea that the saints have gone beyond their natural limitations. But of course, it's not just a matter of working really hard or using tech properly. They're going beyond. Started as a gift from God, started as the gift of grace. They collaborated with that gift of grace, and they achieved a transcendence. You know, there is a transhumanar, a going beyond human nature, but it's a going beyond human nature that perfects the nature without destroying it or radically altering it. I mean, I think we will forever be human beings. As I said earlier, we're not going to be mere brutes or mere animals. We have this unique spiritual dimension that is exercised and displayed in all sorts of marvelous ways through our intellect, through our moral agency and free choice, and all of the great cultural, artistic expressions of that. But we are also bodily creatures. So we are given and receive a particular nature, but within that particular nature, there's so much dynamism and so much room for creativity, and that's the drama of the moral life. And we, in a certain sense, we shape ourselves. So when the secular transhumanists use this language of self-creation, self-invention, we want to distance ourselves from that kind of radical autonomy where I just define for myself the meaning and value and purpose of my life as though I'm the main author of my story. But in a secondary sense, we do play an active role in our story. We have a divine storyteller. He's the one who gives us our nature, our ultimate meaning and purpose. but he doesn't want us to be passive recipients. He wants us to take an active role in collaborating with him, discovering that purpose and exercising it through free choice and really growing and shaping our character through virtue. So I think that there is, in a certain sense, a richer, deeper notion of Catholic transhumanism. But again, it's not a denial or rejection or shame in our nature. It's an embrace of our nature, even its limitations, its weakness, its fragility, and it's an effort to take all of that, including the illness, sickness, suffering, and death, and in collaboration with the Lord and His grace, elevate that and find our perfection and our fulfillment as human beings.
Yeah, it seems like there is a similarity there at the root of the secular transhumanists and sort of you're articulating that Christian transhumanist view that we're meant for something else. In a sense, there's something that we're meant to transcend where we are, where we find ourselves right now. And the question is, how do we best do that without destroying ourselves? And if we don't know who we are, as you're pointing out, and what we're meant for, then you're going to destroy yourself. It seems to me like the secular transhumanist project is not going to be able to get us to something else, but it could destroy us because it's so complex and trying to genetically modify and neurologically modify us that you might just destroy the person, in trying to do that, because there's so many levels there. But where as from a Christian perspective, as Dante is pointing out, the saints have transcended their humanity. It's something that we can't do fully on ourselves, but we participate in it. As you're pointing out, we're active participants, but we're relying on God rather than just solely on technology. But you wouldn't say that then that just says technology is bad then. Is that we should turn away from that in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, technology is a wonderful expression of our identity and role as co-creators with the Creator, capital C, right? We are made in the image and likeness of God, and technology is an expression of that intelligence. And so He makes us stewards of the earth, and a big part of our stewardship is using technology well and putting it at the service of others. So again, I think there's a lot of room for common ground in figuring out with people of all backgrounds, including the secular transhumanists who certainly have their criticisms of traditional religion. There's room for common ground in finding how to improve our physical, cognitive, mood, and even moral life, and even extend our lifespan, not necessarily through digital immortality, which, as we saw, is problematic, but extending our lifespan in and of itself can be a noble goal if we have a clear sense, as you said, of our identity, our purpose, and our mission on the earth. And then the technology is always understood clearly as a means to that goal. We know where we're going, so we know how to use our tools. And so that is also an area where the church can offer so much leadership. We have the philosophical, theological resources to orient these tools and to use them prudently, in the sense of using the best means to achieve that good end. And so we ought to be involved in all these conversations. I'm spending a lot of time now in conversations with different groups about AI developments, which has always been an element of the transhumanist project, the desire to merge more fully with AI systems in the kind of long-forward singularity movement where man and machine begins to blend, and we have this explosion of intelligence that leads to a whole new form of elevated life. So the secular transhumanists have really been ahead of the game in thinking seriously about AI, its benefits, also about some of its threats. So they've been ahead of the game in AI, but I've been involved in a lot of these conversations of different figures and just become more convinced every day of how much we have to say about the proper use of AI, the proper integration of these technologies in education and medicine and in other fields of life to enrich our lives without dehumanizing ourselves, because we will dehumanize we will dehumanize ourselves if we forget about the human, if we forget about the philosophy and theology. But if we have that philosophy and theology solid, then I'm convinced that we'll use these tools well and will serve people and will enrich lives. And along the way, we ought to collaborate with other people and shed light on the developments that we see all around us. Every major world leader is talking about these tech developments. Every world leader is concerned about the implications of AI for media, education, medicine, and so forth. And so the church is right there in all the joys and sorrows of humanity, and is an expert in humanity, and can teach and illumine and guide the way.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great discussion, and we could go on forever in terms of looking at specific, branches of transhumanism and the AI and its relation to that. And I think you've done a wonderful job helping us sort of frame the issue of, what is transhumanism, and, what does the Catholic Church bring to that conversation about what it really means to be human and the goal of the human life, and to give us some context. So thanks for all the work that you do in this important field, because it's, we're going to be dealing with these technologies and new ones throughout our entire lives. It's not going away. So, Father Baggot, thanks for joining us today, and I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.